This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Natalia Edwards. Tonight's top stories. The race to replace Japan's Prime Minister gets underway. Heavyweights in the ruling LDP lining up as Shigeru Ishiba bows out. How Tokyo and Seoul tighten security ties. Defense chiefs from both sides agree to explore high-tech cooperation and reaffirm their goal of a completely denuclearized Korean Peninsula. Now, Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos visits Cambodia, hailing a new phase in relations and courting the support of Beijing's ally for a tighter code of conduct over the disputed South China Sea. And also ahead, confidence among South Korean companies takes a hit after a U.S. raid on a Hyundai-LG site, with conglomerates reassessing risks for doing business in the U.S. Plus, China's economy still struggling. Export growth in August skids to the slowest pace in 6 months, as a boost from the U.S. trade truce proves to be short-lived. Later in East Asia tonight, South Korea is going to ban mobile phones in classrooms to curb smartphone addiction. But will it work? And what can be done about adults who are just as hooked as the kids? And at least 5 deaths have been confirmed following a shooting attack on the outskirts of Jerusalem. More than a dozen others were injured. Israeli authorities say the terrorists to blame have been neutralized. A leadership scramble as ruling parties determined to hold on to power, while the race to find a new prime minister has begun in Japan. The incumbent Shigeru Ishiba has called time on his tenure. Well, he said that he was resigning to take responsibility for the Liberal Democratic Party's electoral defeats. Under Mr. Ishiba, the LDP lost its majority in both houses of parliament. And he's instructed the party to hold an emergency leadership election, saying he decided to step down now after finalizing a trade deal with the U.S.
私どもの政権とトランプ政権との信頼関係の下で成り立った合意でございますので、私どもの政権においてその責任を全うすべきでありましたが、このような形になったことは実に心残りであります。
Well, the first to throw his hat in the ring is former LDP Secretary General Toshimitsu Motegi. He was the government's chief negotiator during the first Trump administration. He's also been in charge of foreign affairs. Now, reports have also floated other names, and among them, a 64-year-old Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshimasa Hayashi. Now, he's been on top of several portfolios, and his name usually comes up when an incumbent resigns. And LDP veteran Sanei Takaichi, also 64, could also be a contender. But she lost the leadership to Mr. Ishiba just last year. If she runs and wins, she would be Japan's first female prime minister. She was previously in charge of economic security and internal affairs. Now let's look at the younger contenders now. We have Shinjiro Koizumi. He's the son of former Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi, and he presented himself as a reformer before losing out to Mr. Ishiba in the last LDP vote. He could become Japan's youngest Prime Minister in the modern era. But without control of parliament, the new LDP president is not guaranteed the premiership. An opposition leader might just be the next prime minister. Former Prime Minister Yoshihiko Noda leads Japan's biggest opposition group, the Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan. Yuichiro Tamaki might also contest for prime minister. His center-right Democratic Party for the People has been one of the fastest growing in recent elections. Now, for more analysis, we are joined now by CNA's senior correspondent, Micho Ishida, live from Tokyo. So, Mitch, what we're hearing is that the LDP, they're proposing to hold a full-spec election. Basically, it's a longer process involving all LDP members rather than just the lawmakers and the chapter representatives. So, tell us, why is the party doing that?
Well, the date of the LDP presidential election and the number of those who can vote is expected to be officially approved on Tuesday by the Liberal Democratic Party's General Council. But Japanese media are already saying that election day is on the 4th of October, and all 1 million LDP members will be able to vote. And if it happens like this, it's similar to last year's style when Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba won, but with less parliamentarians this time, as many lost their seats in the general election and the upper house election. Now, there are currently 295 LDP parliamentarians, and to equal the balance, 295 votes will be distributed to rank and file members if the system is approved. And election campaign period will likely be at least 12 days. Now, some political watchers complain the campaign period should be shortened to prevent a political vacuum. And that was the case in past presidential elections when LDP president resigned without finishing his term in office. This is the time when LDP collects party membership fees. And there are views LDP wants all to feel that they are part of the voting process to stay with the party. In 2001, the party had 1.7 million members, and it's lost 40% of its members compared to that period. And so that's why perhaps, this full-fledged LDP presidential election is likely to take place.
Yeah, well, that's a huge membership loss there. And if I recall, LDP, they lost 3 major elections under Prime Minister Ishiba. So this change of leadership, will it help LDP regain the support?
Well, political watchers think when the new leader takes over, media polls will likely suggest an improved approval rating. But that could be temporarily. With the new leadership must show willingness to reform LDP and work towards it, and also take specific measures against higher consumer prices, which has been the top concern in the past 3 major elections. Now, Mr. Ishiba last week also mentioned the need for a vision on the economy, rice policy amid doubling of rice prices since last year, and a stronger defense capability in a complex security environment. To pass bills, the new leadership will have to build a good relationship with opposition parties with a substantial number of seats, as the LDP does not hold a majority in both houses of parliament. Now, coalition partner, Komeito, is reporting unwillingness to maintain its relationship with the LDP if a hawkish leader is elected. So the choice of a new party president could change the makeup of the political scene.
All right, October 4th, we will be looking out for that date. Thanks so very much, CNA senior correspondent Michiru Ishida, reporting to us live from Tokyo. Meantime, the defense chiefs of Japan and South Korea have agreed to explore tech cooperation in areas such as AI and unmanned military equipment. Now, the rivals acknowledging the need to ramp up cooperation in a shifting security environment. Japan's Gun Nakatani spoke to An-gu Baek in Seoul on the sidelines of an annual defense forum, both pledging to keep up cooperation with the United States to deter missile and nuclear threats from North Korea. Now, they also reaffirmed their commitment to the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Mr. Nakatani is the first Japanese defense minister to visit South Korea in a decade. And it comes days after China held this massive military parade in Beijing, with leaders from Russia and North Korea standing next to President Xi Jinping in a show of unity. The Philippines and Cambodia have vowed to strengthen cooperation and expand opportunities across key sectors. It follows a meeting between President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and Prime Minister Hun Manet in Phnom Penh. 3 agreements were inked on crime, education, and air services.
Our discussions today signals a new phase in the partnership between the Philippines and Cambodia. One that embraces greater economic opportunities, deeper cooperation on matters of security, and the common resolve to uphold peace and stability in our region.
On defense and security, we will work to further strengthen collaboration through capacity building, joint training, and exchange of officers. We reaffirm our shared commitment to combat transnational crime, especially online scams, through information sharing and law enforcement.
Mr. Marcos is on a 3-day state visit to Cambodia, the first by a Philippine president since 2016. The reciprocal trip comes after Prime Minister Hun Manet's official visit to Manila in February, when the two leaders signed deals on agriculture, education and tourism. And for more insights, let's speak with Don McLain, Gill lecturer at the Department of International Studies, De La Salle University. Well, thanks, Don, for joining us this evening. Let's just kick things off with the big picture question. Why Cambodia and why now?
Thank you very much for having me, Telly, and that's a very interesting question. You know, this trip comes 7 months after the Cambodian Prime Minister's first official visit to Manila. Now, besides what was announced, the more critical motivations behind the Philippine president's trip are likely centered on two interrelated objectives that are linked to the Philippines' ASEAN chairmanship next year. One would be socializing the threats faced by the Philippines in the South China Sea from an expansionist China. And second, of course, is part of the larger effort to project the Philippines as an inclusive ASEAN chair amid criticisms of being an outlier in Southeast Asia. But these are the type of things that won't be talked about, into the public. But again, a continuation of the growing confidence building between the two leaders.
Well, then all the more, Don, we have to press you on for that then, since it's not, publicly talked about. You talked about February's meeting when the two leaders met. That happened in February, where actually President Marcos, he called for more joint training. He called for a defense meeting later this year. How much harder do you think he's going to be pushing for this with this meeting now?
Well, it's not about pushing harder, but to more effectively socialize through diplomatic channels, reinvigorated diplomatic channels, about the necessity to pay attention to maritime security, as the Philippines will try to shed more light on the exacerbating maritime security trends in the region under its upcoming chairmanship. It would need to make sure that these efforts would not be unjustly impeded. Now, if you remember throughout history, both in 2012 and in 2016, it was Cambodia that blocked the Philippines' attempt to mention the challenges it faced within its exclusive economic zone, and in 2016 to make any mention of the 2016 arbitral award. So 4 years later, that pretty much happened in 2016. So Manila would need to effectively socialize its concerns, and based on the recent back-to-back engagements that were made between both leaders, this may create the right avenue for a more equitable understanding of each other's concerns. So for the short term to midterm, Manila is practical about its expectations. It doesn't expect all its neighbors to overtly side with its position, but to ensure that there won't be any diplomatic blunders similar to perhaps 2012 or 2016. So this is the purpose, to ensure that regional discussions would remain rooted in international law and the preservation of UNCLOS, for instance.
Right. So like ASEAN 2026, Manila will be chair. How do you think President Marcos is using this visit to actually line up Cambodian support for a stronger South China Sea code, for instance, given Phnom Penh's closeness to Beijing?
Absolutely. And if we remember, during the visit of the Prime Minister of Cambodia to Manila this year, he stated his country's strong support for the Philippines' ASEAN chairmanship amid, the tumultuous times within the region, without naming, of course, the maritime security issues. But, of course, the purpose here is to ensure, and as President Marcos Jr. continues to emphasize during his interventions in ASEAN meetings, is that Southeast Asian countries must recognize their agency within the overarching U.S.-China power competition, and it is in the best interest of all Southeast Asian countries to ensure the security and stability of their maritime zones and the sea lines of communication to which Cambodia also benefits from. So this has to be rooted based on the TAC and of course, the importance of international law in doing that. So this is merely to remind our friends in Southeast Asia about the commitments of Southeast Asian countries in ensuring that the region is rooted in international law and against forces of revisionism and unilateralism.
Because, I mean, Cambodia is often talked about its ironclad ties with China. We've got Beijing's presence at the Ream Naval Base. So I'm just curious to know, how far can real security cooperation with Manila actually go?
Well, obviously, we have our understandings of the limitations of what to expect. But if we look into the trends that have been happening in the past 2 years alone, there has been an increase in bilateral security cooperation between the Philippines and various Southeast Asian countries. For instance, the Philippines and Singapore have signed an MOU on defense cooperation in 2024. The Philippines and Vietnam, two claimant countries of the South China Sea, have actually begun joint maritime collaborations at sea with their coast guards. Thailand and the Philippines have also been strengthening their defense cooperation. So in this light, we see that the purpose of this visit is not necessarily to expect Cambodia to challenge China's unilateralism in the South China Sea, given, of course, we understand its dependence on China's economics and military support, but to ensure that it understands the situation at hand and that the Philippines is able to communicate this in ways that would not result to any bias within Cambodia. So it's about that level of socialization, I feel, that is serving as a more important aspect of this visit, rather than expecting bilateral maritime security drills between the Philippines and Cambodia, recognizing that this is, of course, something that may not happen in the short to midterm.
Well, that's all the time we have, but thanks so very much for spotlighting the opportunities and also the limits in these talks we have there. Don McLain Gill, lecturer at the Department of International Studies, De La Salle University. On that note, we are going to go for a short break now, but coming up next on East Asia tonight, President Trump calling on multinational companies to, quote, respect U.S. immigration laws after a raid at a Hyundai battery plant created confusion across the South Korean business community. Hello there, you're watching East Asia tonight and you're just in time for some business news with Roland Lim. And Roland, big news about that raid in the U.S. involving Hyundai EV battery plant?
Absolutely, Oteli. Yeah. Massive U.S. immigration raid on a battery factory plant that has snared hundreds of South Korean workers. Now, the raid on the battery plant in the U.S. state of Georgia has rattled the auto industry, prompting some South Korean conglomerates to rethink their U.S. investment plans. LG has reportedly decided to postpone production of its EV battery plant with Hyundai in Georgia. And Hyundai itself has reportedly banned its staff from traveling to the U.S. The raids are expected to throw a spanner in the works after Seoul pledged to invest $150 billion in the U.S. and a further $350 billion in a non-binding agreement as part of a trade deal in an effort to satisfy the Trump administration's tariff threats. More than 300 South Koreans were detained by U.S. immigration officers. They are accused of illegally entering the U.S. while some had expired visas or had entered on a visa waiver that prohibited them from working. Experts seeing the raid emerging as a major diplomatic flashpoint as it came less than 2 weeks after President Lee Jae-myung met with his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump. South Korea's Foreign Minister Cho Hun is also on his way to the U.S. for talks with the aim of bringing its citizens home aboard a chartered flight. Investor reaction to the developments has been muted so far. Shares of Hyundai ending the day nearly 1% lower, while LG Energy Solutions is up 0.3%. President Donald Trump says he'll look into what happened following the raid at the Hyundai Motor facility. Now, he emphasized that the issue is not straining America's relationship with its key Asian ally.
We have a great relationship with South Korea, really good relationship. You know, we just made a trade deal. But I'm going to look at it because I understand exactly what they're saying.
In a post on Truth Social, the leader said that foreign investments are welcome and that companies are encouraged to bring in talent legally to make world-class products in America. He added that in return, he wants Americans to be hired and trained by these companies. For more on this, CNA's senior correspondent Lim Yun-suk joins us from Seoul. Yun-suk, always good to have you on the show. Foreign Minister Cho Hun is set to depart for Washington. What's he hoping to achieve during his talks with Mr. Trump?
Well, he is going to Washington, where he's expected to arrive Tuesday morning for talks with U.S. officials, including the Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Now, South Korea has said that its nationals detained in the recent raid will be released once the administrative procedures are completed. And so Foreign Minister Cho will be going to Washington to ensure those procedures move quickly and to make sure that these South Korean workers do not face any disadvantages when they try to return to the U.S. in the future. Now, at a parliamentary hearing on Monday afternoon, Minister Cho said that there was this broad agreement with the United States on this issue, but stressed that more negotiations were needed between the two sides. He also acknowledged that there was a need for this special visa arrangement, something that South Korea had been trying for 10 years now, trying to get from the U.S. for 10 years now, but was not able to, because South Korea wants this kind of a visa treaty to allow South Korean business people and the companies to enter quickly and legally for work. But Minister Cho said that he's optimistic that this time the U.S. might agree to this because President Lee Jae-myung recently built trust with President Trump at that recent meeting, summit meeting, and that President Trump has hinted he might be open to such a deal. So let's hear what Minister Cho told lawmakers early in Parliament.
이재명 대통령께서 트럼프 대통령과 정상회담에서 상당한 그 신뢰를 쌓았고 그 첫 정상회담도 잘 되었고 그런 결과 이 문제에 대한 트럼프 대통령의 코멘트도 매우 긍정적인 방향으로 이루어졌다고 생각합니다. 그래서 이 상황을 계기로 좋은 방향으로 E4와 또는 쿼타 또는 두 개를 다 합해서 할 수 있는 모든 것을 협상을 해보도록 하겠습니다.
So once in Washington, Minister Cho is expected to secure the Korean safe return, but also negotiate this visa deal to avoid a repeat of this crisis.
So Mr. Cho attended a parliamentary hearing earlier today where he was grilled by lawmakers about the Hyundai raid. What can you tell us about the reactions from other government members?
Well, yes, Mr. Cho was in Parliament just before heading to the airport, where he did face tough questions at this parliamentary hearing. And lawmakers from both the ruling and opposition parties were demanding stronger action from the South Korean government, saying that when Mr. Cho is in Washington, the U.S. should be told that there is this serious criticism in Parliament over this recent raid. One opposition party lawmaker was saying that this was not something for the foreign ministry alone to be handling, but that President Lee Jae-myung should be calling President Trump himself directly to protest against what happened. Another lawmaker from Lee Jae-myung's own ruling party saying, he was shocked, and the South Koreans public here were shocked too to see their people, South Koreans, being tied up in chains and being led away as criminals. So let me share with you what these two lawmakers said in Parliament today.
이 사태는 외교부가 하는 게 아니고요. 적어도 대한민국 대통령이라 그러면 트럼프 대통령에게 전화를 하고 아니면 트럼프 대통령에게 전화 연결을 하라고 하고 그리고 그에 대해서 대한민국 국민의 안전과 생명 지켜달라고 하고 아니 700조를 투자를 했는데 어떻게 이럴 수 있냐고 강력하게 항의하는 그것이 대통령이죠.
국민들이 보고 엄청 충격을 받았습니다. 사실은 저 보면은 케이블 타이를 묶은 것뿐만 아니고 쇠사슬을 묶었어요. 원래 이민 단속할 때 저렇게 쇠사슬을 묶습니까? 사실 온 국민이 굉장히 걱정도 하고 자존심이 또 많이 상하고 대한민국 국회에서 엄청난 지적들이 있었다. 이것은 미 당국자들에게 꼭 한번 이야기를 해주시는 게 필요하다고 생각합니다.
So both the ruling and opposition lawmakers, they're wanting the U.S. to hear and see clearly just, how much anger and concern this incident has caused here in South Korea.
Yoon-suk, the move certainly has cast doubts over whether the U.S. remains a reliable destination for South Korean investments. Do you think we'll see a scale back in these investments?
Well, there's been no official comments from companies operating in the U.S., though unofficially, I did speak to some people in various companies and they have raised concerns. And there are even more concerns that there could be further raids on some of the South Korean companies doing businesses in the United States now. Now, there was a government meeting, and that was led by the Trade Minister Yo Han-gu, and he was saying that South Korea was well aware of the concerns that have been raised regarding South Korea's investment in the United States following this immigration crackdown, and that the South Korean government would be exploring ways to improve the current system. Now, as you said earlier, there are reports, the Korea Economic Daily was reporting that LG Energy was tentatively deciding to postpone the start of its EV battery plant with Hyundai in Georgia, while Hyundai has banned trips to the United States by its staff. But also, we have the chairman of SK Group, Choi Tae-won, who also heads the Korea Chamber of Commerce here, saying and urging the South Korean government to secure U.S. visa quotas to ensure this smooth operations and to make sure that similar incidents don't happen ever again on South Korean companies. And so, while it is too early to say how this raid could affect South Korean companies in the U.S., there are definitely concerns and serious questions over Korean companies and their workers working in the United States because they feel that they're not being protected when they should be. And that is something that the South Korean government needs to deal with the United States and get a resolution real quick, because there are investments being planned by South Korean governments, by South Korean companies in the United States.
Yoon-suk, thank you for that report. And that was CNA's senior correspondent, Lim Yoon-suk, reporting live from Seoul. China's export growth slowed to its weakest level in 6 months as a brief boost from a tariff truce with the U.S. faded. Exports expanded 4.4% on year, worse than estimates. China's shipments to the U.S. fell 33%, the fifth month of double-digit declines. Shipments to Southeast Asia rose more than 22%. Chinese imports increased 1.3% on year, also missing estimates as domestic demand stays weak. A protected slump in the property sector, that's a key store of household wealth, is squeezing consumer spending. Exporters are working to adapt to new global tariffs, even as a temporary truce between the U.S. and China prevented the worst tariff threats. Still, Chinese exports are subjected to a 30% duty, while China has a 10% levy on certain U.S. imports. Chinese producers are trying to export more to markets in Asia, Africa, and Latin America to offset the impact of the tariffs. But no other country comes even close to U.S. consumption power, which once absorbed over $400 billion of Chinese goods annually. Let's take a look at the market reaction. Shanghai Composite and the Shenzhen Component kicking off Monday on a positive note after a choppy week. And in Hong Kong, the Hang Seng Index closing at its highest level in 2 weeks. And I'll be back with more business news a little later on. Oteli.
Thanks so very much for that, Roland. Well, we are going to go for another break now, but coming up next on East Asia tonight, South Korea joins a long list of countries to restrict the use of mobile phones in the classroom. What measures worked and what didn't? We'll check in with an expert. This is East Asia tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. The race to replace Japan's Prime Minister gets underway. Heavyweights in the ruling LDP lining up as Shigeru Ishiba bows out. Tokyo and Seoul tighten security ties. Defense chiefs from both sides agree to explore high-tech cooperation and reaffirm their goal of a completely denuclearized Korean Peninsula. And confidence among South Korean companies takes a hit after a U.S. raid on a Hyundai-LG site, with conglomerates reassessing risks of doing business in the U.S. Now, South Korea has passed a bill that basically bans students from using mobile phones and smart devices in the classroom. Officials want to curb smartphone addiction, which is a real worry that parents everywhere recognize. But plenty of students and youth groups aren't buying it. They say the ban is heavy-handed and teens should learn self-control, not lose a choice. Other experts are raising another red flag. Locking up devices could slow students down in a country sprinting into digital learning and AI. Now, many teachers, though, are relieved. They are already collecting phones. A national rule gives them clear backing and maybe calmer lessons. Well, the latest move drops into a wider fight over teacher authority. Strict child protection laws and outspoken parents often leave discipline in a legal gray zone. Now, this ban starts next March, but the fine print isn't out yet. Experts say schools still need clear do's and don'ts and a fair way to enforce them. And for more on this, we have with us in the studio Roy Lee, Assistant Professor of Information Systems Technology and Design at the Singapore University of Technology and Design. Well, thanks, Roy, for joining us here in the studio today. So as what we've reported, let's begin with enforcement, right, in South Korea. So from March 2026, teachers in Seoul, they'll be empowered to restrict the phones campus-wide. But realistically, right, how effective is that enforcement going to be? Bearing in mind as well that a lot of students actually aren't afraid of punishment, and especially when it comes to this one-child career, we are actually seeing entitlement among the kids rising. So in fact, sometimes the teachers are afraid of the students.
Right. So I guess you rightly pointed out that the issue is probably on the enforcement part. So you know how effective it's going to be for this particular enforcement. But I do see that in the short term, this could be quite effective. You know, probably the students will be, less distracted with their phones being confiscated and all. So I guess we might see that effect. But the issue is probably, I sort of worry about the long-term effectiveness of this particular ban, because, banning that during classroom hours is just probably going to shift the smartphone usage to after-school hours, right? So they might find themselves, using the phone more extensively. After
it's that
school
whole
hours.
forbidden food idea that, if I can't have it now, I'm going to double up, after school. So perhaps this is the first entry point, right, to get the kids to be less addicted to their phones, and then maybe, other things will kick in. But South Korea isn't alone in this, because we've got China, Japan, Australia. They've actually all tried versions of banning the schools, right? Banning the phones in schools. So what did they get right? What did they miss? And what sort of measurable outcomes came out of that? Right. So I guess different countries are seeing this as an issue, and they have all tried different ways of actually looking at this. Like, they have also explored and experiments with the different age threshold to basically implement this. China has very strict online gaming rules or laws for minors. Australia is now exploring, social media restriction for age under 16. And of course, Japan largely, leave it to the local communities to basically look at this. There isn't a one-size-fits-all answer to this as of what we are seeing. But we are seeing that the prelim results are coming back saying that probably they should look at packing these rules to the developmental readiness of the children, and of course focusing more on the positive use case rather than just putting a ban on this. So right now there isn't a conclusive answer, and many of these things are very longitudinal. We probably need to wait a few more years to see the effects of this, actually. But by the time we wait for a few more years, right, I mean, it's not even going to be the phone anymore. It could possibly be wearables, AR glasses and all of that. So technology doesn't stand still, right? So how do we future-proof the rules so that we don't have to keep sort of revisiting that, a few years from now? I guess you raise a very good point, which is why I also share the opinion that a ban is probably not the right and only solution to this. It's probably have to pair with educational programs to basically teach the right digital use or digital wellness usage of all these kind of devices.
So I guess this has to be a longer term thing, right? So basically to teach them, how to exercise self-regulations in terms of like using the phones or using many of these smart devices and all. Having the educational element actually sort of like be able to tackle this on a longer term basis.
But I have to press you there on that point because it is very addictive. I mean, like we use it and because of the algorithm. So it's not the phone per se, right?
Yes.
It's the internet on the phone.
Right.
And it knows what you like, it keeps feeding you. So how, talk about this addictive behavior. Some argue that actually it lies with the tech companies, that perhaps also should governments push these platforms to make their design de-addictive, that means less addictive. Is that possibly the next step? I mean, is it even possible to get these firms to comply?
Right. I guess this is a bit counterintuitive, right? Because for businesses, they want to create killer apps that basically are going to let their users stick and all. So this is sort of like going against their business ideas or business principles in a way. But then again, looking at this on a wider societal implications, I guess this is where the government comes in to basically impose certain restrictions and basically push the companies to basically consider imposing some of this. Sort of like, it's not so much about making it less attractive, less addictive, but probably considering, what kind of materials or what kind of functions should, kids of a certain age not have access to, right? So these are things that I think are currently underexplored. But of course, these are things that it's unlikely that the companies are going to take the initiative to basically push this. The government will have to basically come in to say, look, this is important to us. Let's look into this and let's figure a solution for this part.
And I guess parents want clarity. And I remember reading articles that, Steve Jobs, they really limit iPad use among his kids. Bill Gates only gave his kid the iPhone at age 14. So is there an ideal age where, it's been seen that when children should get their first smartphone?
Okay. So again, I think this is still open research topic. So I guess we are still collecting evidence of what would be the appropriate age for this. But I guess as we go, this is a very trial and error thing, and of course it really depends on the individual parents to basically set what would be the right age to basically communicate this to the kids, and when would be a good time to basically let the kids to use this, right? And balancing, of course, on thinking about longer terms, like digital literacies and all, we don't want the kids to basically lose out, in terms of engaging some of these like smart devices and all. So I guess it's really tough decisions for parents and, of course, for schools to basically make decisions on this.
And also, right, I mean, the thing is that we've been very tough on kids, but adults themselves are the super users, right? So actually, what's being done to help adults sort of manage their smartphone addiction?
Right. So I guess, fortunately or unfortunately, we don't have a ban on smartphones for adults yet in Singapore. But we do have like national initiatives to basically promote good, healthy, digital usage and habits. So I guess that part is already put in place. And of course, as individual, we probably can take some small steps. Like, for example, setting off-screen times limits and, of course, putting away your phone during meals. That would certainly help. And relating it back to children, right? I guess another important message is the kids do mirror our behavior. Yeah. So if you are going to put a ban or impose a restriction on phone usage to the children, but at the same time, over the dining table you're scrolling your phones while you're having a meal, that's sort of like sending a mixed message to the children, right? So that's not going to be that effective. So my guess is that this will have to be a sort of like a family and a societal effort, and not just a children problem.
Right. And also outside of the classroom, sort of parents have to be the role models and play the part. Well, thanks so very much for giving a sharper lens, on this new classroom phone ban we've been talking about. And there I was just talking to Roy Lee. He's Assistant Professor of Information Systems, Technology and Design at SUTD. Well, time now for another break, but coming up next on East Asia tonight, Singapore biotech startup Meraxus debuts on the Hun Sen Composite Index. CEO Zhou Lihan tells us about his expansion plans. Stay tuned. At least 5 people have been killed in a shooting attack on the outskirts of Jerusalem. More than a dozen others were injured. Two gunmen reportedly boarded a bus and opened fire on passengers. Israeli police are describing it as a suspected terrorist attack. The perpetrators were killed at the scene. There is no immediate claim of responsibility from any armed groups. And Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has inspected the shooting scene as condemnation of the attack pours in. We'll be bringing you more updates on Asia tonight in about an hour's time, right here on CNA. Some normalcy gradually returning to Hong Kong as tropical storm Tapa barrels further inland, prompting the city to lower its typhoon warning from 8 to 3. Tapa earlier lashed Hong Kong with gale-force winds and heavy downpours, leaving at least a dozen people injured. More than 200 residents had sought refuge at temporary shelters across the city. Some affected transportation services have begun to resume operations. The city's weather forecaster says it will further lower the storm warning signal when Tapa is deemed to pose less of a threat. The storm is expected to further weaken into a low-pressure area. Heavy rainfall, however, will persist across the territory until tomorrow.
I feel like when I take photos with my dad outside, I feel like I'm about to be blown away by the wind. I feel like I'm as light as a piece of paper.
这次来到香港，这个台风并没有影响到我的心情。我作为这个大陆的北方人，第一次遇到这个台风，然后这个台风，气势很磅礴，然后把这个海浪，传得很汹涌，感觉也挺有意思，没有一番那个风景，挺有意思。
Well, it is time now for some business news, more business news rather, with Roland Lim. And Roland, let's talk about Singapore-based biotech startup Marex's gaining inclusion in the Hang Seng Index just 3 months after its listing. That's a big deal.
That is a big deal. That's right, Oteli. The inclusion underscores the growing recognition of biotech companies in the region. Now, for Marex's, the move is expected to enhance its appeal to a wider range of investors, including institutional funds and exchange-traded funds that track the index. Its shares had a positive start to the trading session in Hong Kong, but ended the day 6.8% lower on profit-taking. Earlier, I caught up with Zhou Lihan, who is co-founder and CEO of Marex's, as he eyes a bigger capital pool.
Biotech companies like Marex's invest significantly to develop technology and conduct clinical trials. Because of that, we need access to sophisticated and patient capital to fuel our growth. Now, since the launch of the Chapter 18A biotech listing rule at Hong Kong Exchange back in 2018, the exchange has cultivated a strong ecosystem of investors who understand the long gestation period for biotech and also the value that we are creating in that process. So listing in Hong Kong really gave Marex's access to the capital that's necessary to fuel our growth.
Do you foresee a secondary listings or presence in Singapore's market eventually? I mean, this is a made-in-Singapore market company.
Absolutely. Personally, I believe very strongly that the capital market serves the companies as well as the stakeholders in the environment which the companies operate in. So with 50% or more of our revenue firmly anchored through Singapore and our neighboring countries, it only makes sense for us to eventually have a listing in Singapore.
And from an investor point of view, how would you balance, say, the research and development burn with commercial ramp so that investors can really see a credible path towards cash flow positivity?
Now, I think that's the challenge that some of our new investors in Asia-Pacific faces. And for Marex's, which is 11 years in the making, we are already in early stage of commercialization. So it's quite evident from our latest half-year report, well, our revenue has grown 50% and our profit has also increased significantly in terms of gross margin. So while we continue to invest about $20 million every year to keep pace of the technology development and clinical trials, our revenue is ramping up quite quickly. And this is driven primarily by two growth areas. Firstly, the expected approval of our key product, GastroClear, which detects stomach cancer at very early stage. Now, China is the largest market for stomach cancer. So that growth, that approval is going to drive our growth. Secondly, the encouraging adoption of early detection as well as precision medicine solutions across Southeast Asia post-COVID is also a key factor that's driving up our revenue and profitability in Southeast Asia.
So GastroClear for you is going to be a game changer. What's the single biggest operational bottleneck then for scaling cancer tests, like, say, for example, when we scaled COVID tests?
Right. So compared to the Western countries, US or Europe, I think the biggest challenge in terms of providing mass screening is the lack of systematic reimbursement. So in the US, our peer companies gets the cancer screening test reimbursed at $500 to $1,400 per test. Now, we don't get that kind of payer in Asia Pacific, right? Well, there's a strong unmet need in our part of the world. I think the reimbursement is one single challenging factor. But having said that, we see that people are willing to pay out of pocket, as well as commercial insurance and public insurance are increasingly looking at covering more screening tests because it saves lives and also saves the escalating healthcare cost.
What would it then take for, say, every 40 to 70-year-old in Asia to do an annual blood screen test? What needs to be put into place?
Well, I think firstly, we need to develop good screening tests. Till today, there's only been 5 screening tests approved worldwide, 3 in the US and 2 in Asia, including that by Meraxas. So we are at the verge of seeing a lot of new blood tests coming into the marketplace. So that's increasing the accuracy. COVID did us a great favor. The silver lining of the pandemic is that it has built up so much testing capability, which will make these tests a lot more accessible. Okay? So I foresee in the next 3 to 5 years, the convergence of lowering costs, accessibility of these tests, and the increasing willingness to pay from both insurance as well as possible government policies will drive a lot more adoption of these tests in Asia Pacific.
China's Hesai Group is planning to raise around $497 million from a dual primary listing in Hong Kong. It will be the first of a group of US-listed Chinese firms to list their shares in Hong Kong after renewed fears of delisting in the US. The group aims to sell 17 million shares, or at about $30 each. The offering opened today and closes on Thursday, with the final price to be determined by Friday. The shares are scheduled to be listed on the main board of the Hong Kong Stock Exchange on September 16th. It also allocated another 2.55 million shares if there is demand. The company is the world's largest supplier of automotive LiDAR sensors for self-driving vehicles. It has been caught up in frictions between Washington and Beijing. It was included in the Department of War's list of Chinese military companies last year. It is also one of nearly 300 Chinese companies listed in the US that have faced renewed delisting risks. The Japanese economy expanded 2.2% annually in the second quarter. That's almost twice the growth reported by the initial estimates a month ago. And this gives a snapshot of Prime Minister Ishiba's performance and shapes market sentiment ahead of the next Prime Minister. Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba's resignation affecting Japanese markets, Nikkei 225, getting a boost, ending the day 1.5% higher, and the Japanese yen also weaker against the greenback by 0.3%, 147.81 to the dollar. Meantime, yields on super long Japanese government bonds have been trading near records, with the debt being sold off on concerns about the country's fiscal deficit and domestic political pressures. Mr. Ishida's exit was on the cards after his party's poor election results in July. But a period of fiscal prudence under his leadership, big questions remain regarding his potential successor and its implication for the country's spending. That's especially so given concerns over Japan's massive debt and widening fiscal deficit. Calls have grown for the country to spend more, increasing pressure on Japan's fiscal health. And experts say that could complicate the Bank of Japan's plan to lift interest rates. And that's it for me, for business, for telly.
Well, thanks so very much for that, Roland. And on that note, it is time to wrap up East Asia Tonight.
And don't forget, headlines anytime at cna.asia. Plus, we're on Facebook and YouTube.
Thanks for watching. Good night.